Good evening. We are here for day 25 of the International Great Black Read Aloud Day. We have been doing this for 25 days, and every day has been an enjoyable day. We thank everyone who's participated, those of you who have viewed, those of you who've read. We are thankful for you participating in our inaugural day or days of the International Great Black Read Aloud Day. And today is day 25, and our topic for today is loss, grief, and transition. And so we are going to be reading a selection from The End is Just the Beginning by Reverend Arlene Churn. And I don't know if you can see that exactly because of time of day, I think. But I think if I go that way, now, if I go to the camera, that works. So it's The End is Just the Beginning, Lessons in Grieving for African Americans. And so we're going to read a portion from the introduction, and then we'll read chapter 2. And from the introduction, excuse me, it starts. Although many books have been written on the subject of death and dying, and particularly on the process of grieving, few, if any, have been written by Blacks specifically for the African American community. Because the experience of facing the passing of a loved one is so personal and traumatic, I believe we need to recognize the fact that people of color respond to death from a specific cultural perspective. We need to address the significant cultural differences between the ways African Americans and people of other ethnic backgrounds think about death and the manner in which it is appropriate or inappropriate to grieve. Just as people of Jewish heritage have one particular codified set of rituals for burial and mourning, and those of Irish Catholic descent, for example, have another, African Americans' unique manner of dealing with death and mourning results from deep-seated traditions handed down through generations since the times of slavery. The need for this book was brought home to me most forcefully in the midst of my writing by the tragedy of September 11, 2001. In that time of national mourning, all Americans came together with racial, ethnic, and religious differences forgotten. But the fact remains, as reported in the Washington Post, that a surprisingly overwhelming percentage of those who died in the attack on the Pentagon were Black. I don't know how many African Americans died in the World Trade Center, but surely the numbers were large. And one particular Black hero of that day remains virtually anonymous to the American public. He was a 36-year-old Leroy Homer, co-pilot of Flight 93, which crashed near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. With so many of our brothers and sisters lost on that day, our community was grieving, certainly along with the rest of America, but also in our own way and for our own people. African Americans are now coming to the realization that death is a part of life and that grieving is a natural reaction to the loss of a loved one. However, many Blacks still need to understand that grief comes in many guises and that no one kind of loss is more or less worthy of grief than any other. Only the one who is grieving can fully understand the nature and extent of his or her own feelings. And if for no other reason than that, even if we ourselves do not share those feelings, while we must all learn to look with compassion and patience only the one who is grieving can fully understand the nature and extent of his or her own feelings. And if for no other reason than that, we must all learn to look with compassion and patience upon the grief of others, even if we ourselves do not share those feelings. While many experts have looked at these specific, codified, and predictable stages of grief, I have chosen to reflect instead upon different kinds of grief because not all deaths are alike. And my experience over many years counseling thousands of grievers has taught me that not all mourning follows the same path or trajectory. And we are going to read from chapter 2, Death is a Part of Life, as well. Death is a part of life. He is a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Isaiah 53, verse 3, part B. In the African American culture, we need to know that death and grief are a part of the rhythms of life. The Random House Dictionary defines grief as keen mental suffering or distress over affliction or loss, sharp sorrow, painful regret. It's an emotion that must be processed over time, and the road to healing is often a long and lonely one. Many African Americans appear to be delayed in their pursuit of healing and resolution after the death of a loved one because they don't understand that permanent closure is virtually impossible to achieve. The deceased one is never really forgotten or banished from our thoughts. As an example of our remembrance, reverence, and ongoing celebration for our dead, we have only to think of figures such as civil rights martyrs Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, the 6 little girls who were burned to death in a Birmingham church in the 1960s, the revolutionary activist Malcolm X, or even the hip-hop icon Tupac Shakur. As a people, we seem to have total recall about death. Whether the one who's gone as a close family member, a friend, or a celebrity of national prominence, we remember the day, the hour, where we were, and what we were doing at the time of death. When we discuss the dead, words like, I remember it as if it were yesterday, or I'll never forget it as long as I live, bring nods of acknowledgement affirming that I know what you mean, I feel the same way. As a group, we must learn to accept the fact that the death of a loved one is not the termination of the griever's life as well, and that the life of the survivor can be one of restored joy and fulfillment. We simply need to realize that their end is our beginning. We have to learn how to keep moving on through grief, mourning, and personal loss, and not move into a state of perpetual grief. Grieving for a loved one should not become all-consuming. The impact of death has caused too many people in our culture to stop living and simply exist on memories of the dead. We must learn that there is no magic moment of closure or invisible eraser to wipe away the pain, loneliness, and bitterness. But each day is an opportunity to begin to live life without the physical presence of the deceased. Extended grieving can also be an act of selfishness. For few of us invite others to share in our grief, and we often resent and refuse the efforts of other people to help us in the process of healing. I recall one group therapy session during which a client was very uncomfortable and left almost immediately. When I asked why she'd left, she said she'd been upset because everyone else in the group seemed to be happy. I told her that they were at that stage of grief recovery when smiles and pleasantries were permissible without feeling guilty. But she indicated that she would never get to that point. I asked if she intended to go through the rest of her life without ever smiling or laughing again, and she sadly replied, "That's the way I feel right now." Like countless others, this woman believed her life had ended with the death of her loved one, who, in this instance, was her husband. Too many people lose their personal identity in the grieving process because of the labels attached to them by society. People are called widows or widowers, childless mothers or fathers, or orphans, and they then often assume those identities. The wife without a husband or the husband without a wife, becoming the bereft parents or the motherless or fatherless child. We must never lose our sense of self or self-worth, because regardless of the loss of a loved one, we are still somebody, and somebody who is yet alive. We must learn to live our life as an individual rather than living as an extension of a deceased relative or intimate friend. It's a challenge to live without certain loved ones in our life, but it can be done. While the deceased can never be replaced, nor should we try to replace them, we must allow room for a new beginning without them, knowing that our life has been forever blessed and enriched because of them. Life will never be the same is the cry of so many grievers, but in that bitter cry lies a brutal truth that death is a part of life. Life does go on in spite of death, disappointment, heartache, and pain. For solace, I would ask the bereaved to look at St. Paul the Apostle, who in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, King James Version, addresses death with these words: O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? I believe the message of this passage is that we should look upon death not as the victory of a mortal enemy, but rather as an interruption in the flow of life. African American elders, who were almost always creative in their descriptions of the final passage, have been known to refer to death as the grim reaper arriving on a horse without a rider, or to explain the departure of a loved one as being summoned home by God and carried away by the death angel. When the deceased was of advanced years, it was said that his work on earth was done. And when a child died, the family was enjoined to take comfort in the fact that only the good die young. In recent years, however, African Americans have begun to reject these simplistic explanations and to react to death with an outward display of their anger and disbelief. One family with whom I had worked lost their only daughter, Monique, in a car accident that also involved the deaths of 6 other teenagers. Monique's mother, Dorothy, was upset because she felt, based on what she saw as their lack of extreme mourning, that no one else in the family really loved Monique. She didn't understand how her husband, Donald, could return to work so soon after the funeral, or how her son, Matthew, could resume his after-school sports activities and discuss his games without ever mentioning his sister's name. Matthew liked to play video games with his friends, and he asked that he be allowed to move from his smaller bedroom into Monique's larger room, so he'd have more space for his posters and his collection of Star Trek figures. His mother insisted, however, that the room remain exactly as it was before Monique's death. She said she felt Monique's presence in that room. She was convinced that she and her daughter communicated in that room, and she was angry that her husband and son chose not to share the experience. Dorothy believed that each of their lives and their demeanor should be permanently altered as a result of Monique's death. She was angry that her husband could go bowling. She was upset that she never saw him cry or appear depressed, and she didn't understand how he could tell her, "You need to get over it and get on with your life." What life? To her, life had ended forever when Monique died, and that included the family's life as well. Dorothy had stopped all her activities, including singing in the church choir and attending the meetings and functions of her social club. She refused to go anywhere except to work as a teller in a downtown bank. Her grief can be compared to that of the biblical Rachel. Jeremiah 31:15 speaks of Rachel's bitter weeping and lamentation for her children and of her refusal to be comforted. A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel, weeping for her children, refused to be comforted for her children because they were not. However, in verse 16 of that same chapter, there is divine promise in the words, "There is hope in thine end, saith the Lord." Dorothy's entire family was in dire state of complicated grief and mourning because they were unable to understand each other's way of grieving. Donald returned to work and to his other activities and almost never mentioned his daughter's name. Dorothy interpreted his behavior as a lack of love for his daughter. But African American men are often pressured to be manly in every situation. And from early childhood, many Black males are told a man ain't supposed to cry. Boys who cry when they're hurt or embarrassed are told to be a man, and tears are viewed as a sign of weakness by both their elders and their peers. This misconception about displaying emotion causes many African American men to adopt a stoic facade. I won't cry, I can handle it because I'm a man, and men don't cry. Black men do grieve differently from women. Yet, men must learn that they also need to express their feelings and that it's okay for men to cry. And in this case, Donald, like many African American men, needed to return to work almost immediately because of the family's financial situation. Often, men in the workplace don't know how to extend comfort and support to another man, and they simply expect him to do his job. Donald, however, should have served as an example for his son, who needed to see him express verbal and nonverbal feelings as a man dealing with grief. Dorothy, for her part, needed to understand that her husband was grieving for their daughter in his own private way, and they both had to learn to support and encourage one another during this trying time. I counseled them to share their feelings and fears, hurt, and pain. And the family also needed to see that Matthew, like all children, was grieving in cycles. Children need the emotional relief of grieving, and then they need to do what children their age would do under normal circumstances. Both Donald and Dorothy had to be reminded that Monique's death was a new experience for them, both as a family and as individuals. Matthew had learned the harsh fact that not only the sick and elderly die, but that accidents and illness claim the lives of young people as well. I shared with him the words of a wise old soul who once told me, life is a journey, and we travel on life's path until the path ends. For some, it's a long journey. For others, it's a short trip. But it's important to enjoy the journey at whatever pace you travel. The family finally admitted that Monique had enjoyed life, and that when her life abruptly ended, she was with friends, all of whom came to the end of their journey together. She hadn't died alone, and the other children's families were also feeling grief and pain over the loss of their children. The realization of one's need and desire to overcome constant grieving is eloquently expressed in the words of Martha, one of my clients, who came into therapy because she said she was sick and tired of being sick and tired. Martha had grieved over her father's death for 5 long years. Becoming his caregiver after he had a stroke had become her whole life. She felt that caring for him was her reason for living, and she tried to meet his every need on a daily basis. She bathed him, fed him, and spent every waking moment she could by his side. Martha had put her own life on hold because of her love for her dad. She insisted that it was not a burden to care for him, and she believed he would have done the same for her. She felt she was obligated to this labor of love because of the sacrifices her father had made to ensure her education by working 2 jobs, which she felt had been the cause of his failing health. Her mother had died when Martha was only 15 years old, and she couldn't recall her father's ever having a date or taking a vacation without her after that. When his stroke left him paralyzed and bedridden, she vowed he would never go into a nursing facility, and she was true to her word. She learned how to inject his prescribed medication intravenously, and she had no problem diapering him when that was necessary. She did it all and never complained. When he died, she was lost, and she discovered that at the age of 39, she had forgotten how to live. Her sorrow was deep and painful, and she was in a state of despair. She had no companion or close relatives, and good girlfriends had become a thing of the past. After 5 years of grieving, she was tired and confused about how to start living a real life again. Martha and others like her have to learn that life demands living until you die. They have to learn that life does go on, even in the absence of a loved one, or in spite of a loss that has caused extended grief and mourning. There is your life to live after death, and the griever needs to acknowledge that death is a part of life. Another of my clients who needed to learn this bitter but ultimately liberating lesson had experienced the death of a loved one under circumstances that couldn't have been more different from those of Martha and her family. Lee was a high school teacher who had been adopted by birth by an elderly, stern, but loving couple in the rural South. He is typical of those African American children who are generally labeled old folks' children. and who, because of the age of their parents, are said to be old before their time. Although his parents were themselves farmers, they made sure to teach him the value of education. They also taught him the love of God because God had given him to them, and they emphasized the importance of living by the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. They instilled in him the notion that he should be a friend, but not get too friendly, and above all, that he should mind his own business. Lee was content with his lifestyle because, after all, it was the only one he knew. When he left to attend a black college about 300 miles from home, his parents gave him $50 and a suitcase packed with bare essentials. He was terrified but determined to succeed. After an uneventful but successful college experience, he graduated with honors and secured a teaching position in a small town in New Jersey. He saved and sent money home, and he visited as often as he could. When his father died suddenly, Lee believed he had to return to the farm to help his mother, who was herself elderly and ill. He found a job in a small school district near his parents' homestead and rented out the land for the grazing of cattle and horses. He had no friends in the area, only distant family, but being there for his mother made him feel needed. He also felt that he was in some way repaying her for having chosen him as a son. She was confined to his sickbed for 12 years, during which time Lee refused, despite the advice of her doctor, to put his mother in a nursing home. He took care of her at home with the help of a nursing assistant during his working hours. When she finally succumbed, Lee experienced a double loss. He became deeply depressed, and while in counseling, he admitted that he had wanted her to live, despite her failing health, because she was all he had. He finally realized that he didn't know how to live because he didn't know himself, that he had long held a secret hope that at some point before she died, his mother would tell him the circumstances surrounding his adoption. He had absolutely no information about his biological family, and this was adding to his grief. Lee believed that he'd had a limited life before his mother's death, but now he had no life at all. He knew how to exist, but he didn't know how to live. African Americans excel at surviving and existing, but for many, real living, especially after the death of a dependent loved one, can be extremely difficult. These people view death as the end of all life, for they die emotionally with the death of their loved one. Like others who grieve excessively, Lee had to learn that death is a part of life, but that his mother's death was not the end of his life. He had to develop a formula for life without his mother. My advice to Lee was to put the past in perspective. It was past, period. And what he'd experienced was also past. As to those unanswered questions about his biological family, I asked Lee the following questions. If you knew, what is it you would know? What difference would it make at this stage of your life? A bitter truth about grieving is that neither tears, nor regret, nor hostile feelings about the fairness of life will change the present situation. Death is irreversible and will always remain a mystery to those who grieve. But life is for the living and should be lived to the fullest by all. Learn to express your feelings, but don't expect others to feel what you feel. Seek to restore your spiritual connection with God. Spend time in silent prayer and meditation, asking for strength and faith. Use your experience to assist others in their time of need. Put the past in its proper perspective. It is past, period, and what you also experienced is in the past. Create a change in your environment. Undertake a project, rearrange your personal space. Don't become enslaved to memories, but work at developing new ones. Don't deny yourself the opportunity to love again or trust again, or to explore a different style of living. Regardless of your loss, love yourself and take care of yourself physically. Don't become dependent on others for your healing, but rather practice self-healing, for healing and happiness begin with you. Grief is a burden to the griever. and is excessively heavy baggage to carry through life on a daily basis. So learn to unpack that baggage a little at a time. Celebrate the fact that despite everything you've been through, you are yet alive. Remind yourself that death is but a part of life and that life consists of other components as well. In every life, there comes a time to walk in shadows and in sunlight, to hear silence and song, to shed tears of sadness and of joy, to forget what has been taken and remember what has been given. Author unknown. Lessons in healing. Do not continue to live only as an extension of your deceased loved one. You are an individual who must continue to live until your own life is over. Shed your tears, regret your losses, ask God for strength and faith, and then put the past in its proper perspective and live your life to the fullest. Express your feelings, but don't expect others to feel exactly as you do. In healing words, I now seek higher knowledge as I submit to divine order in all things. I await the ecstasy of a divinely directed life. We have read this evening for day 25, Loss, Grief, and Transition. We have read From the End is Just the Beginning by Reverend Arlene Churn. And this is a wonderful book if you have been dealing with loss and grief and the transition of a loved one. I highly recommend that you read The End is Just the Beginning. And we will see you tomorrow for day 26, which is erotica. And we invite you to join us and read if you would like to tomorrow, wherever you are in the world. It is the International Great Black Read Aloud Day, and we are reading erotica tomorrow. So we'll see you tomorrow. We hope you have a wonderful evening or morning or whenever you listen to this. May the rest of your day, whatever that portion may be a wonderful day. And we'll see you tomorrow for day 26 of the International Great Black Read Aloud Day. Have a good night.